Thank you so much for having me.
Uh, well, thank you for writing this brief, which is entitled "Under Primacy, Weapons Sales Will Always Supersede Human Rights." And I'm going to sort of spoil the conclusion a little bit because I think there's one sentence that I wonder if it didn't form the kernel of the idea for writing this entire piece. It's in the conclusion, and a paragraph begins: "The myth that American primacy upholds human rights lies buried beneath the rubble of Gaza." Is that was that one of the inspirations for writing this?
Yeah, absolutely. This was informed by the year I spent working on human rights at the State Department before I resigned last March against the Biden administration's essentially unconditional support for Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. And it was interesting subsequently to look into some of that. This was also informed by some of the historical background of the ways that the United States has claimed to stand up for human rights and the ways that this advocacy is, in fact, written into US law. And yet, as your listeners are probably well aware, human rights certainly do not drive America's foreign policy. But it was very interesting for me as someone who worked directly on this, was involved in writing with colleagues the human rights reports that come out every year. Um, the fact that while I was working on those, there was no mention and no recognition of the fact that the purpose of the human rights reports and the reason Congress legislated these reports into existence in the 1970s was to determine a country's eligibility for purchasing American weapons. That is not part of the conversation inside the State Department. It is interesting now because obviously the bureau where I worked is being significantly reordered under Marco Rubio. Much of what the State Department used to do as far as human rights advocacy or trying to promote things like freedom of speech, protections for journalists, those kinds of things are no longer priorities under the Trump administration. But in the brief, I'm trying to avoid some of what I think we saw in the transition from the first Trump administration to Biden, which was kind of this notion that America really does stand for human rights. And Biden came in promising to reassert American leadership and we support democracy, yada, yada. And that is not, in fact, true. And so who know, in terms of the post-Trump, I mean, unclear when and if that is going to happen. But I do worry somewhat about the rose-colored glasses with which people might look at the Biden administration as being this bastion of human rights advocacy or democracy promotion to say, no, human rights have never driven US foreign policy. And a huge part of that is as long as our actual foreign policy is driven by military primacy, part of which is manifested in weapons sales. And the US is the largest weapons manufacturer and seller in the world and has been since the 1950s. Human rights are never going to drive our foreign policy because we are never going to risk a relationship with a government that is a good customer of ours for purchasing these weapons. And this is part of what I observed so frequently at the State Department was that the human rights concerns that are stated publicly, whether by the Secretary of State or other mouthpieces of the U.S. government, it's only about U.S. adversaries, countries in the Middle East, Syria, Iran, or outside the Middle East, whether it's, China's human rights record or Russia's or Venezuela's. This is where the State Department tends to talk a lot about human rights violations because the US doesn't sell these countries weapons. Whereas we're not going to talk about human rights violations by Saudi Arabia, by Egypt, by Israel, at least not at the highest levels. It's interesting because the State Department, at least under Biden, still recorded these human rights violations, which is part of what I talk about in the brief. But it is not something that got much attention. And now under Trump, obviously this part of what the State Department does is even more marginal. But I just want to be clear, it was already marginalized under Biden and previously.
Well, yes, and you resigned out of conscience, as did several others. It struck me during the Biden administration that, and I'd love your thoughts on this. You were on the inside, obviously, but there had been, at least since the 1970s, an internal tension between the professed desire, as reflected in congressional laws and so on, to incorporate human rights into our foreign policy and military decision making, and this drive for military superiority, for primacy. But it's what struck me about the Biden administration uh, regarding Israel was it felt, I'm kind of cynical, but it felt breathtaking how entirely it seemed that respect for international law, international institutions, U.S. laws designed to protect those rights was absolutely thrown out the window. So, on the one hand, you're saying that, yes, the Biden administration did profess concern for these things, but it became, uh, I think, overwhelmingly, well, not to everybody, obviously, but to many people, overwhelmingly self contradictory and hypocritical when it came to, whether it was rejecting international courts, international law, the so called Leahy law, that, uh, that it was, uh, I don't know, I was rendered speechless by it. I can't imagine what it was like to go through it on the inside.
Absolutely. And, the hypocrisy really was breathtaking, in particular due to the ways in which the Biden administration saw support for Ukraine as affirming America's leadership, going against Russia, the big bad autocracy, and supporting democratic Ukraine in the narrative. And then and the human rights of Ukrainians. I think I mentioned in the brief the fact that for the first time ever, US intelligence, not just sort of, usually with the human rights reports, the State Department relies on publicly available information to document human rights violations. These reports are public. They are, not based on classified data. However, in the case of Ukraine, the intelligence apparatus was mobilized to document human rights violations Russia was committing against Ukrainians, which is commendable, but it was only in Ukraine that that was done. And again, to sort of bolster this case against Russia and to try to galvanize a movement, a global movement to oppose Russia. And so the absolute scope, the sort of unspeakable scope of the scale of the hypocrisy of this prioritization of the human rights of Ukrainians and the complete abnegation of any recognition of the human rights of Palestinians was in part just made the work that I was doing in my office of trying to advocate for human rights elsewhere in the Middle East to say, so and so North African government, you need to stop locking up journalists, you've got political prisoners, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it was impossible to do this work. We were a laughingstock,
Mm-hmm.
such that the US government sort of walked back some of our efforts on human rights, just acknowledging that you can't, the hypocrisy was so rank that we really could no longer do our jobs.
And one of the things that was striking to me about it, Annelle, was uh, Democrats in particular. It used to be Democrats and Republicans, but primarily Democrats used to use the rhetoric of soft power, right? They used to say, you know, I don't know how real it was at various points in history of various decades, but the idea that America, the United States of America, had some credibility on these issues or developed some credibility on these issues, and therefore we didn't always have to project ourselves militarily. Our credibility as a beacon of democracy, etc., of human rights, would serve us well globally. But while the Biden administration used the rhetoric of soft power adjacent, where the shining light of democracy and all that stuff. Um, it seemed to me there was an extraordinary lack of self awareness of the extent to which they were basically, I mean, not only what you guys were going through internally in the Human Rights Division of the State Department, but globally, that in most parts of the world, outside perhaps the NATO states, the US seemed to be taking whatever remaining credibility it had in that area and lighting it on fire without any awareness. I mean, these are supposed to be smart folks. Whatever you think of, or I may think of their tactical choices, they're supposed to be intelligent, and yet it seemed entirely oblivious. Am I wrong about that?
No, absolutely. You're not wrong. And I remember asking about this, actually getting to ask Blinken himself about this because these concerns were so widespread, not universal. Obviously, there were plenty of people inside the State Department who very much supported Biden's unconditional support to Israel, but many people were concerned not only about the moral implications, but very much about sort of from a US interest perspective or
Right.
from a US security perspective, what are we doing? This is putting Americans at risk. This is putting our relationships at risk. This goes against everything that the Biden administration said that they cared about, whether it was kind of reestablishing the US as a leader in international institutions, the so-called rules-based international order,
Right.
you know, international cooperation, whether from climate change or, just all of this was, as you said, just kind of lighting all of these other ostensibly central US interests on fire for the sake of this unconditional support for Israel. And I asked Blinken this, and he didn't have an answer. His answer was essentially the bear hug that the US has to continue to bear hug Israel, to not have any daylight between the US and Israel such that we can influence them. And clearly, the Biden administration never used America's extensive influence, which takes the shape of $3.4 billion we send Israel every year. And in the year after October 7th, the US sent Israel $18 billion. The US has enormous leverage over Israel that Biden never once used, such that Trump was then able to come in and actually use some of that leverage to get that initial ceasefire in January, and then unfortunately was either uninterested or unwilling to keep up the pressure to force Netanyahu to stick to phase two of the ceasefire and actually move forward towards resolving to ending the genocide. Um,
And arms
so
shipments have continued under Trump, have
Oh,
they?
absolutely. They've
Yeah.
they've gone up. I mean, I do commend Trump for the ways that he is willing to buck Netanyahu's preferences on certain things, whether it's the ceasefire with the Houthis or negotiating
Yes.
directly with Iran or lifting sanctions on Syria. But on Gaza and the West Bank, unfortunately, Trump and Netanyahu still seem to be, or at least Trump has not yet taken any concrete action to signal that he has had enough of Netanyahu continuing to renege on agreements. I mean, we, just in the past few days and again today, rumor or, reports coming out that there is a ceasefire. And then as soon as Israel says, well, no, actually, we don't, we agreed, but now we don't agree, then the US dumps all over and says, well, Hamas was the one that pulled out. When
Right.
repeatedly it's been Hamas willing to agree and to release the hostages. And Israel then says, no, actually, what we really want to do is just keep dropping bombs and starving Palestinians.
And of course, needless to say, perhaps it's horrifying, but let's get to this idea of primacy because, I think a lot of people struggle with uh, the seeming irrationality of our behavior. And I think a lot of people may say, on the one hand, I guess the so called defense industry, the military, the armaments industry is just so powerful that they can dictate policy. And on the other hand, they say, well, that can't possibly be. There are other big corporations, banks, and so on. So they alone can't do it. But what you describe in your brief is a kind of grim yin yang of sort of American military aspiration. I'm paraphrasing, so please tell me if I'm wrong. But what I got from it was primacy, the idea that America should be remain the number one military superpower in the world, has created this kind of symbiotic relationship with the military industry where each reinforces each other, and the military capability of the U.S. I mean, we famously had to build it up for World War II, but now it has to be permanent and massive, and therefore human rights can never get in the way of that imperative. Is that sort of getting to the point of what you're trying to say?
Yes, yeah, exactly. That military primacy is our overarching foreign policy objective, kind of for its own sake, based on this notion that if the US isn't ordering the world, the alternative is chaos. And I mean, this is a big part of what the Quincy Institute does is to articulate the ways in which that is the US is no longer in this position of kind of the sole global superpower. We are moving towards a multipolar world order. Although the United States does continue to maintain military primacy and continues to be, to have sort of the most cutting edge technology, the nature of warfare itself is also shifting, such that cheap and numerous drones and small
Right.
munitions can have a much bigger impact. And I mean, we also saw this during the War on Terror when, America's hugely expensive, exquisite equipment really was incapable of the reality of dealing with an entire population resisting
Right.
occupation and trying to expel the foreign invader. I mean, this is a very old lesson that the U.S. should have learned in Vietnam, failed to learn really in Iraq or Afghanistan, that I think that what would the Taliban say? Like, you have the watches, but we have the time. Like, we're not going anywhere.
Uh-huh.
This is our country. And eventually the United States is going to get tired and go home. Um,
And now we've had Trump, it seems to me, essentially surrendering to the Houthis, who've been able to, I suppose they've gotten assistance from Iran and so on, but using that relatively low tech technology of drones and missiles, low tech compared to what, for example, Israel or the United States can muster, they were able to paralyze global shipping. And it's, I mean, the two things that strike me about that, it seems an affirmation that bigger is not always better. And I would suspect that in many parts of the global south, uh, the Houthis are seen as the good guys at this point.
well, two points on that. I mean, first of all, the Houthis really did not paralyze global shipping. It simply meant that ships go elsewhere. They go around the
Right.
Horn of Africa. And what's interesting is the shipping companies themselves haven't been all that put out about it. I think mainly the Egyptians are frustrated because there are fewer revenues from the Suez Canal.
Right.
Um, but as far as whose interests are really being harmed here. I mean, this came up in the Signalgate chat where there was this question of, well, how is this really such a central issue for an America First US administration? Like this isn't really affecting Americans or American shipping companies all that much. But secondly, certainly to your point that the Houthis were capable of redirecting global shipping in with using significantly less advanced or expensive technology. I mean, in many ways, I commend Trump for being willing to shift, for demonstrating the
Right.
flexibility that, look, we've already lost three jets, each of which cost $67 million. Dollars. We've already spent $3 billion here, and we're not getting anywhere. So let's just walk away, and in many ways, I worry that the ceasefire with the Houthis may not last. It may have been largely intended to keep tensions a little lower while Trump was in the Gulf. I know the Saudis really very much wanted tensions to be cooled down. And the Saudis are not interested in reinitiating their 7-year war with the Houthis, where they eventually called a truce as well. Nor do the Saudis want the US or Israel to launch a war with Iran, which would then have Iran pointing
Right.
web missiles back at Saudi Arabia. So I commend Trump for being willing to say, you know what, this isn't actually central to U.S. interests. We don't have to keep wasting billions of dollars firing on the Houthis, who've already been able to withstand years and years of airstrikes from Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
And you're right that the shipping companies didn't have a problem with it. I think they raised prices. In fact, I think their profits have soared now, I
Right.
believe. But end costs for imported goods went up during the Biden administration's. It helped drive a stake through that. At least in that way, the Biden presidency and the role of inflation in it. And yet, it always strikes me, that Biden's counterattack against the Houthis was called Operation Prosperity Guardian. The irony of that just never escaped me. But so, in a sense, Trump, you're saying, can be commended. He's stepping outside of the primacy issue here and saying, we don't have to win this one. We can just cut our own deal, which seems in some ways classic to his personality, but probably a surprise to Netanyahu, I would think. But what about primacy in terms of, the U.S. military dominance? We hear the rhetoric from Biden and Trump, and they're both administrations, that China's the huge threat, Russia's the huge threat. We have to accelerate spending to counter them. But when I look at spending, relatively, China's what, 1/7 of what we spend. Russia's what, less, a 12th, maybe. I don't know. Maybe the numbers have gone up a little bit, but it seems to me that we're accelerating tensions and spurring additional. I mean, Ukraine complicates things with Russia, but in the case of China, it seems to me, if anything, sending ships into the Taiwan Straits or South China Sea and all the. It seems to me that, which we budgeted 3.4 billion, I think, under the last Biden budget at least. It seems to me that that's accelerating a spending cycle that speaks to this primacy issue you describe, but does nothing to alleviate human rights in China or anywhere else. Am I right about that?
I mean, absolutely. You look at the US military budget, at least at last count, I think was greater than the next 7 countries combined. At this point, we're looking at $1 trillion military budget, so it may even be more than that. But much of it is really about just putting money into the pockets of these big weapons manufacturers, the big five, including companies like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, but now also the new sort of tech companies that are looking to compete and get in on some of these really lucrative government contracts. And if you look at reporting by my colleagues at Quincy, looking at the inordinate amounts of money that the Pentagon pays for the most basic items, a pen costing tens of thousands of, it's insane the amount of money sloshing around the Pentagon, which has never passed an audit. I think they've had 7 audits and none of them have passed. Um, so at this point, and then, things like the big beautiful bill, that is moving forward, cutting all kinds of services to Americans, and yet pumping vast amounts of money into the military industrial complex, into the Pentagon. The notion of the Golden Dome, that the United States should have some kind of missile defense system similar to Israel, which is completely not possible to achieve, but Trump is willing to throw huge amounts of money and military contracts at these companies to try, just these are our tax dollars being spent on a boondoggle, similar to so many other things that the military industrial complex spends its money on. But, members of Congress keep getting more and more money from these big companies, and the weapons lobby. And, Trump and his cronies benefit, these companies benefit, their shareholders benefit, Americans are stuck with the bill, and it does increase the likelihood of war. China, Russia, other countries see the US continuing to spend more and more. I mean, this is the security dilemma from international relations theory, that the more a country spends on its own defense, the more other countries then feel that they have to, even if a country is merely doing it to try to feel more secure and they're not actually necessarily trying to sort of gear up for an aggressive, like an act of aggression. So it's unfortunately, but at the same time, Trump did manage to sort of portray himself as the peace candidate, in contrast to Democrats who for so long have been so allergic to being characterized as, insufficiently hard on whichever adversary, and so have been willing to go along with these heightened expense, weapons spending. And so Trump, realizing that, tapping into American fatigue with the forever wars, the massive amounts of money and the horrors, veterans coming home with PTSD, not only for what they witnessed happening to their fellow soldiers, but also for what they did, for atrocities committed in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And Americans don't want to do this again. And so Trump, as a clever politician, has tapped
Right.
into that and portrays himself as keeping out of the forever wars. And that's a big part of the America First appeal and why many people voted for him. I mean, my hope is simply that progressives and Democrats will realize that this is a winning political game to sort of be more of a peace candidate than Trump, and to point out that, well, actually, I'm the candidate who's going to take this money and not spend it on the Pentagon, but I'm actually going to spend it on Americans' real security, which comes from healthcare and education and, like climate change, and or preventing the worst outcomes of climate change. And to sort of catch Trump in a lie, because he's not. I mean, in some ways, like I said, I do commend the ways that he has avoided sort of the knee-jerk neocon leg of the Republican Party. But again, I don't necessarily see Democrats looking to tap into this very broad sentiment. And I just hope that moving forward, Democratic candidates will realize that this is what many Americans are looking for.
There was a striking study, I'm sure you saw it, indicating that in 2020, the communities in Wisconsin hardest hit by war casualties voted disproportionately for Trump and may have given him that state and therefore, I guess, the presidency. But that seems to be a tough lesson to get across. But since we've been talking about presidents a lot, let's just conclude maybe by looping Congress into this. You write that since the 1970s, Washington has cast itself as a defender of global human rights when Congress passed laws to bar the U.S. from providing security assistance to human rights violators. Then you go on to say Congress has still never successfully voted to block a weapons sale. I didn't realize that. I couldn't think of if you pressed me, I wouldn't be able to think of an example where they did. But so they passed the law and they don't follow it, I guess, right?
Well, within Congress, unfortunately, if the president is moving forward with a weapons sale, if it sort of passes a threshold of a size at which it has to, get congressional approval, it goes through automatically unless Congress passes a joint resolution of disapproval against it. So the argument would be, actually Congress should have to vote affirmatively for a weapons sale. Like, the onus should be on Congress to affirm this rather than having, and otherwise it doesn't happen. Whereas right now, it automatically happens unless sufficient congressional opposition can be raised to prevent it. And so, for example, people may remember in the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder and the horrifying images coming out of Yemen, Saudi Arabia starving children in Yemen, lots of parallels to Gaza. There was a successful vote in the Senate to block weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, but Trump vetoed it. And there was insufficient votes to override the veto, and so the sale proceeded. But yes, under that mechanism of the joint resolution of disapproval, Congress has never successfully blocked a weapon sale.
And after that horrific murder happened, I remember Biden's strong words of disapproval for Mohammed bin Salman. I also remember his fist bump, if my memory serves me well, as president. So here we are in this loop, and I think your brief has been a great addition to the conversation about it. I mean, what's next? Just more writing and more pushing for a better understanding of what this mechanism is doing to us?
I mean, it's interesting because, like I said, one reason I wanted to talk about this was to avoid the rose-colored glasses of Biden actually advocated for human rights. I do think in many ways the fact that Biden used the rhetoric and cared about human rights of Ukrainians, for example, broke apart the organizations that care, sort of splintered the coalition. Whereas Trump, because he clearly does not care about human rights at all, offers more of a galvanizing opponent, and whether it's organizations or countries that want to affirm their belief in the centrality of human rights, which is supposed to govern international law, is supposed to sort of govern our post-World War II world order, which is evolving. I mean, this is another thing of what I and my colleagues talk about is the need for the global order to be rethought. That sort of the order that emerged in the aftermath of World War II continued to prioritize the power of the United States and European countries and didn't recognize the fact that moving forward, there are other parts of the world representing the majority of humanity that are not well represented in things like the UN Security Council, for example. So the need in the longer term to reform these institutions if we're going to continue to use them, because the alternative is they lose all legitimacy. And this has certainly come up, I think, in the context of Gaza, as the international community has tried to impose accountability on Israel and the United States has blocked that accountability at every turn. It has made glaringly obvious the need for new institutions that actually can rein in a rogue state committing genocide, even if one of the global superpowers is backing it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So in terms of, thinking about next steps, I am somewhat heartened by some efforts we are seeing, at least on the issue of Gaza. We are coming up to this UN conference that France and Saudi Arabia are going to be holding next month on the question of Palestine. I have been seeing more momentum gathering around this, the idea that it is long past time for the international community to move forward with the formal recognition of a state of Palestine and to hold Israel accountable, requiring it to also recognize a state of Palestine. This is something that I've been working on with my colleagues here, of trying to continue to build on that kind of momentum. But it's certainly something that I do think many Americans feel somewhat like we continue to see these horrifying images coming out of Gaza, and I think people are feeling really disheartened and disempowered. But call your senators. I mean, we still live in a democracy for now. Call your members of Congress. Tell them that you want a shift in U.S. policy on this. I live in Washington, D.C., where we don't have congressional representation. So I wish that I did, because I know that for now, members of Congress do still listen to constituents.
We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.